Everyone's wearing headphones.
Hello, everybody.
Yo,
Thank you very
Lauren.
much for joining us on a Saturday afternoon. My guess, if you want to mute yourself for the feedback, and then when you're called up, we can go ahead and bring you back on. But I'd like to introduce you all to our wonderful panel here that we have today as we have a conversation about gender rights, who decides for children. If you didn't catch our Fundamental Truth episode earlier in January when we're live in Red Deer, we had a Q&A panel where several of the guests on our panel here today were sitting there. And one of the questions that came up was, what to do about gender reassignment surgery, puberty blockers for children, and whether or not Danielle Smith was taking the right path to step in and ban things and take action. And it led to a really lively conversation. There wasn't a consensus on that stage, but there was definitely a lot of opinions and strong ones. So we decided to continue this conversation. Just a first heads up, is Lathan Gray was scheduled to join us today, but being live, an event happened in his personal life where he had to step out, but we have Jeff Evely stepping in to take on the position of what a parent who actually has to live through this actually feels about it, and some of the opinions there, because Jeff has had, I don't know if you want to call it the honor or the pleasure, but speaking with Leader of the Opposition, Pierre Poilievre, about his position on this. So he's going to bring some great insights to this conversation. I do have our co-host here, Melanie Bennet, who's one of the great guests that we have on the Lavigne show often to have conversations, especially as she has escaped from the left camp and decided to kind of take a different look and perspective of how our children are being treated in the schools, especially around SOGI, and how improper that is. We have Shawn Buckley of the famous Buckleys. He's joining us here today to take a look at what happens when you let the government walk in through that door of having a say in your health care and in your life. Is that a good door to open? Should we be bolting that one shut? And is there a way to close it once you've opened it? Mia Hughes is back as well, who has a very strong opinion that we need to protect the children. We got to do something because these radical gender people have really changed the narrative and have come after the children strong, and something needs to be done. Bruce Pardy is back once again. Thanks for coming on Friday. But today we're going to be talking about what does freedom really look like? And if you really want to be free, what are some of the things you have to consider? And then, of course, Jeff Evely, with his personal perspective, will be joining us. So I'm Jason Lavigne, host of the Lavigne Show, and I also hosted that event in Red Deer. And I put this panel together because we wanted to finish up that conversation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the panel, ask everybody to quickly introduce themselves to the audience. You probably know all of them, but let's go ahead and say hello. Let's start with Melanie.
I think you did a pretty good introduction there. I do cover a lot of education, more how education is being transformed politically. Some might call it radicalizing education. And I am an investigative journalist with Juno News.
Thanks a lot for joining us, Melanie. And you were basically a last minute addition, but you and I had you on recently, and I said, hey, you're going to be a great co-host for this conversation. You jumped at it, and I'm looking forward to doing this with you. Shawn, welcome back to the show. Great to see you. You've been busy. You took a small vacation, and you're back. So welcome back. I want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm a constitutional lawyer. I've been practicing law for 32 years, and a large part of that practice, at least half of it, has been in the area of health law and drug regulation, and basically trying to protect our access to natural remedies, which kind of speaks to the very core of, who has ownership over your body and what privileges, because we don't really have rights here, what privileges the government is going to afford us. So I'm very pleased to be here, Jason.
Thank you very much, Shawn. I'm looking forward to the input. You've got years of experience pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID. So thank you for coming to bring that perspective to us. And then we have Jeff. It's not a beard, it's a mane. Evely joining us as well. Jeff, go ahead and introduce yourself. And that does not look like the woods you're in.
Negative. So yeah, I'm Jeff Evely. I'm a 20-year veteran of the CAF, tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Upon my medical release in 2021, I got involved in a lot of things, namely the convoy, Rolling Thunder, James Top, 1 Million March for Children, the 2025 election, and then the Nova Scotia Woods ban of 2023, for which most people know me. But I also have a personal story. My daughter is a victim of gender ideology. She was groomed in Ottawa schools and stalked by the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario while I was in Iraq, no less. And I told Pierre Poilievre all about it before he went on to vote for the conversion therapy ban that we're all here to discuss tonight 2 more times.
Thank you very much for bringing that, and thanks for your strength on that one, Jeff. It's a very difficult conversation, but it's one that we need to have. I think it was a great addition to this panel to have you here. We also have Bruce Pardy, known as Cold Water Bruce, because he just tells you like it is. Sometimes you don't like to hear it, but you need to hear it. Bruce, welcome back. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey, thanks, Jason, for having me. Yes, I am indeed a barbarian and general troublemaker. I'm also the executive director of Rights Probe, which is a law and liberty think tank, part of the Energy Probe Research Foundation, and a professor at the law school at Queen's.
Thanks very much, Bruce, for joining us again. And then Mia, I think you were the one that kind of kicked off this conversation. You really want to protect children. Your speech has been going viral all over the internet since January, so congratulations on that. And you've been retweeted again by J.K. Rowling.
That's
so
correct.
You must be a very troublemaker if you're getting those retweets. Mia, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yes, I am a troublemaker too. I'm a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, director of Genspect Canada. I've been researching the gender issue for 6 years now. And in my 6 years, I've very much come to the conclusion that pediatric gender medicine certainly is the worst medical scandal in the history of modern medicine. There's nothing that can parallel it. And so I've written about the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. I've written extensively on the diagnoses related to gender issues and the social contagion that is drawing all of these young people in. And I'm excited to have this discussion tonight. Thank you.
Let's see if we can get you another human rights complaint today. Maybe we all will get one. Who knows? Because when you touch this conversation, that sometimes can be the outcome of that. Actually, let's go ahead and start there with the BC Human Rights Board in their recent decision. $750,000 was assessed to Barry Neufeld for expressing that he does not think this is something that needs to be in schools. Let's go ahead and start with me on that one, and then we'll make our way to Shawn, Jeff, and then Bruce. What are your thoughts about that assessment from the BC Tribunal, Human Rights Tribunal? Is it fair? Is it over the top? Or is it something that definitely does not need to be happening in society today?
I think it's clear evidence that the human rights tribunals need to be abolished. I think it is so far over the top that hopefully it triggers a wave of backlash against human rights tribunals that very clearly do not uphold the human rights of Canadians equally. Barry Neufeld, 9-year legal saga. It's way too complicated to go into, but essentially what disturbed me the most about the ruling was this, it's discrimination against trans-identified people if you do not believe in gender identities. And actually, maybe we should all state very clearly what we think about that. I'm going to make it very clear. I don't believe in gender identities. Trying to make me believe in gender identities would be like trying to make an evolutionary biologist believe in creationism. It's just impossible. I can't believe in gender identities because I know far too much about what the concept of gender identity is masking, what it really means. So I think children have a right to a childhood grounded in truth, a right to an education that is grounded in truth, not grounded in an insane, incoherent, dangerous political ideology. So yeah, like abolish the human rights tribunals. That's my conclusion.
Okay, thank you very much. So Shawn, same question. And then if you would like to state your position, what do you think about gender ideology? That's fine. But the question is whether or not tribunals have gone too far. And what's your opinion on the decision out of BC?
So let's first of all put into context what happened here. So first of all, I think we need to understand that Barry Neufeld was an elected school trustee when this began and had a history of being a school trustee. Barry Neufeld also has worked for his entire career as a probation officer with expertise with sex offenders. And the last time I interviewed him would have been in October of 2024 under oath. But back then he was still working with sex offenders. And he sees this SOGI agenda being pushed into the schools. He's meeting with sex offenders that are literally telling him that they don't have to groom children anymore because the schools have groomed children for them. I mean, if you're a sex offender, without going into any detail, I mean, before we taught children, groomed them with this SOGI, if you wanted to get children to do acts, you even had to introduce the concept of those acts into their minds. That was part of the grooming process. But our schools have done that for us. And, you know, so he's concerned. The real issue here is when you're elected school trustee, is it now possible for you to voice concerns that go against political narratives? Because what we've done here is we've politicized the Human Rights Tribunal. He's got fined like $750,000. I mean, help me out. You can, you know, run into somebody with a car and they're a quadriplegic. They're not going to get $750,000. Like, what's going on here? What person can possibly survive paying a $750,000 fine off with after-tax income? None of us could afford that. So my real concern with this is that it's setting a precedent, a public precedent, to basically muzzle any elected school trustee, or for that matter, any elected person or somebody in a position of authority. If anyone should have the right to question anything happening in schools, it's got to be school trustees. And so I find this absolutely outrageous and really part of the muzzling and censorship process where we're all becoming afraid to speak.
Okay, I think we all agree with that for sure, and that's the shot across the bow to anybody who wants to speak up, trustee, school related, and even in other professions. The 750,000 is insane. Jeff, you got 25,000 for walking in the woods, not 250 or 750,000, which would be crippling. But what are your thoughts as somebody who has a child touched through the school systems by this, especially that comment that Barry Neufeld says you don't need to groom children anymore, the schools are doing it for you?
Well, I mean, I said that during my introduction too. Yeah, that's what I believe happened as well. And they're also, as far as I can tell, coached by the schools to not share information like this with parents, because I engaged on this issue quite a bit with my daughter around the kitchen table. And, you know, we talked about these things, talked about everything that was going on in their lives, because no phones were allowed at the kitchen table, but they will coach them, as far as I can tell, to hide this from parents. And also, one aspect of the grooming is that, you know, if you disagree, if you voice your concerns as a parent, then they do tend to view view you as something like an abuser or an oppressor, the same way that Barry Neufeld is being cast here. And I was kind of way ahead of the curve. I was asking the question back in 2015, what is a boy? I don't believe in gender identity, gender ideology either. And when it came down to it with my daughter, I mean, it was always the case that if we had a disagreement, my kids were welcome to disagree so long as it was done so dispassionately, respectfully, and logical. And when I tried to get her to present a logical argument as to what being a boy actually meant, she wasn't able to do it. And so on that basis, I rejected the claim in 2015, well before any of this stuff became royally assented, at least when it came to Bill C-16, for example, that introduced gender identity and gender expression into the Canadian Human Rights Code, royally assented in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, this has been my life. I didn't choose this form of activism. It chose me.
Thank you very much for that. And again, thanks for bringing that to the panel tonight. Bruce, we'll come to you now. You've heard like 3 or 4 different examples of the government being involved in people's lives, whether it's tribunal, bills, through the schools. And so what are your thoughts about the BC decision, the tribunal, and government in general being involved?
Right. Well, I agree with everything that everybody has said. The decision is appalling. The tribunals ought to be abolished. You know, there are only 2 sexes. And the grooming and the transitioning that you do to children is appalling. I agree with everybody about that. But there's a cautionary tale here in more ways than one. And that is in the following way. The Neufeld decision is an illustration of what can happen when you give the state powers. The tribunal is a state apparatus. It's a little bit like a court. It's an administrative tribunal. And it has been tasked with making decisions about how people can speak and whether or not they can discriminate against other people. But this is just one example of what happens when you give the state power. And I'm afraid that if you live by the sword, you die by the sword. That's the risk. And what I mean by that is, if you perceive a problem and you think that something is wrong, and if your immediate reaction is, well, let's go and give the government power to stop that, then you are essentially doing what has happened with the tribunal. You are giving the state power to intervene, and that's the sword. And if you live by that sword, you're likely also to die by that sword, which is what has happened to Barry Neufeld. He has had that sword turned against him. And that's what's happening in the modern era. We've had that sword turned against us. And my first reaction is that the solution to this is not to try to get the state to fix the state. It is to get the state out of the way and stop interfering with people's lives. If you didn't have the state intervening, then you wouldn't have the grooming in the schools. You wouldn't have the healthcare system insisting upon doing this to kids. You wouldn't have the social contagion that has taken over, or seems to have, in Canada. A lot of this trouble would have been avoided if you didn't have the state involved, you didn't have the state empowered. And so I think that question is the question upon which we need to talk a little bit.
Okay, so thanks for sending down that foundation as we're making our way through this panel. I'm going to throw it to Melanie now, who has an initial question she'd like to pose to the panel.
That was really interesting to listen to, everybody. I want to take what Bruce was saying about the state becoming involved in decision makings, giving power to the state. And one of the things that everyone here, I think, probably agrees on is what's happening with children is a little bit crazy. And so what should or shouldn't the state be doing to, say, for example, stop the transitions in schools, stop parents being kept in the dark, for example? Should the state intervene or not intervene in that?
Okay, so let's start with Shawn, because what we'll do is we'll start with a different person and make our way through, and then we'll end up on Mia. Shawn? So,
first of all, I think we all agree that, basically this needs to be stopped. So I think everyone on this panel is of the view that children are being harmed. Well, who is responsible for that harm to the children? It's actually the government that has deliberately created this situation. So the government's already assumed control. So back to what Bruce said, we gave the government the sword. So we've done a couple of things. First of all, Canada has signed on to treaties with the UN committing us to this SOGI agenda. Now, different school boards and different teachers can, decide not to do it. But basically, our government has signed on to this commitment. We've signed on to international human rights agreements that basically have placed us in this situation where disagreeing with this agenda has been criminalized. So, it's hate speech. It's against human rights law within Canada. And governments then have also allowed this to happen by taking away parental rights in several ways. So first of all, they've created, and this is provincially, they've created this mature minor where minors actually have the right to decide to undergo medical treatments without parental supervision and without parental guidance, which in this case, and I'm going to go over 3 minutes, sorry. In this case, I'll try and keep it short. It's absolute madness, isn't it? Because there's no consent. So we've allowed children to do this, but because of our international treaty obligations, which basically reframe the issue, and this was touched on by by Jeff when he was speaking is basically you're viewed as an abuser if you're a parent and you disagree with that. So we're basically criminalizing parents who actually making proper decisions for their children would not consent to this. And, you know, I've interviewed parents under oath where they've basically lost control of their children, where the state has, you know, counseled the children not to share with what's going on and actually moved the children to other provinces so that they could undergo these surgeries. So the state shouldn't be involved. The problem is that the state has taken away parental rights and is wielding this sword that none of us consented to or anticipated.
Jeff?
Yeah, I think that we are vehemently disagreeing. None of what the state is engaged in here is what it is initially intended for. And it is the case that we are dealing with a state intervention right now. It's a state intervention into our lives, our children's lives, and our families. So we wouldn't be asking the state to intervene in this case. We would be asking it to desist from intervening in our lives. And really, like the purpose of the state is it's a monopolization of the initiation of the use of force. We don't have the right to initiate force against one another. Only the state can do that, and so its entire purpose is to pacify to pacify the territory, to secure the territory, hunt down criminals, that kind of thing. So unless you are looking for a legal means of coercion and violence, the right to initiate force, then there's no need really to engage with the state. That is essentially its entire purpose. So highly inappropriate to have it intervening in our children's education and also in their health and family lives.
Okay, we'll move to Bruce next.
Yeah, no, 100%. No question. But notice the argument that's being made, which I agree with, that the state has no business doing what it's doing. It has no business intervening. It has no business taking control of your children. It has no business proceeding on procedures that the parents do not consent to. It has no business using the school system to groom the kids, and so on. This argument is an argument in favor of parental rights. All of that I completely agree with. But note now what happens if you change the case. The first case we're talking about is, for my money, an easy case. This is the case where the parents say, no way. And the state says, oh, yes. In that situation, it, to me, is clear as a bell. The parents get to say what happens to the child. That's the easy case. The hard case is when the parents agree. The child wants to be transitioned. The mother says yes. The father says yes. People who are arguing against that a minute ago were talking about parental rights. Where are the parental rights now? We've got a problem. Because what is going to be done to the child is going to be appalling. On the other hand, we just finished saying that the parent should have control and not the state, and the state should not intervene. So my concern is this: we've got to get the story straight. Is it the job of the state to intervene for the health of the child? If you give the state that power, you're likely to end up with exactly what we have now. Because once the state has that power, you cannot control the kind of decisions it's going to make.
Okay, and Mia?
Okay, I've kind of forgotten what the original question was, but just let me let me respond to Bruce, because I don't understand this idea. I don't understand. To me, the state is responsible for child welfare. There are times when parents don't know best, and we have all kinds of age restrictions in place where we do not let minors do certain things or make certain decisions because they do not have the capacity to make those decisions. And we don't let the parents decide for them. And so I don't understand why an age restriction on pediatric gender medicine, on these drugs that are unproven and clearly the harms outweigh the benefits, why that would lead to something terrible.
Okay, so
Can Bruce and I have a back and forth on that?
well,
Can I
first,
respond?
I'd love to jump in there too.
I'm sure you all do. I'm sure you all do. Let me just do one thing first. Melanie, can you repeat the question for Mia so we get that part out as well?
Okay, sorry.
Well, it was deliberately very vague. I wanted to get everybody's view on the state's role in deciding whether or not children should transition.
Okay, and so I think Mia did touch on that.
Okay, I can go back. I can go back to that though, and I think Bruce and I agree on this, that in an ideal world, it's definitely not the state's decision. It's a question of medical ethics. Where Bruce and I disagree, I think, is when medical ethics has left the building, when a field of medicine has no ethical principles. I prioritize child welfare over some kind of hypothetical state overreach that I can't envision.
Right.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to phrase a question which is going to solicit the same response.
Write down the question this time.
Yeah. So my question, and we'll start now with Jeff, Bruce, Mia, then end with Shawn, is there a time where the state should step in? And for example, when it comes to drugs and alcohol, if you give it to a minor, even as a parent, you could be charged with endangering a child or the delinquency of a child. There's criminal code statutes involved in that. So are there times where the state should intervene, even if the parent does agree? And I think that will solicit the responses you guys were ready to do. Jeff, we'll start with you.
Sure. I would say that parents do not have a right to abuse their children, and that's what this is. It's child abuse. And going back to what I was saying before about the nature of the state, I mean, it's the Leviathan, as Thomas Hobbes described it. It's basically a junkyard dog. You need it for your security to ward off predators, but don't ever let it get its head higher than you, and don't get into bed with it unless you want fleas. Its purpose really is to prevent the coercion and exploitation of its citizens. That's what its security function really is. And what's been flipped around here in the last several years is we've moved from a free society to one that is more authoritarian. And it was Hayek who said that a free society is one that is free of coercion. So that is what a state does in a free society, is it prevents the coercion and exploitation of its citizens, but it's moved from a state that follows the guiding mantra of the Roman Empire, which was do as you will, but don't harm another, to one of do as I say or else. The line here when it comes to, just ethics in general is harm. If you're in an ethical dilemma, you have a choice between two options, and some harm will result no matter what. Your task is to choose the least harmful option available. That is ethics in a nutshell. And none of that seems to apply anymore. It's all been thrown out the window. We're no longer a free society. We don't have ethical medicine, and we sure as heck don't have an appropriate state for a free and democratic society.
Okay. And Bruce, is there room anywhere in your mind for government intervention against a parent's wishes?
Well, Jeff is speaking my language. I totally agree with what he's saying. The dilemma is that once you hand over state authority on these various topics, the state is going to exercise that authority in what it regards as the ethical way to do things. And so if you assign to the state the job of looking after child welfare, rather than deciding that a child, cannot be transitioned, which, let me be very clear, I hope it's very clear, I completely agree with me and others, that's an abomination. But if you give the state that power, it is just as likely to decide that the parents cannot intervene on that transition, and moreover, decide on other things that the parents must go along with because it is in the interest of the child, like you must get your children vaccinated. Because if you don't, that's child abuse. Right? I agree with Jeff about what the proper role of the state ought to be. But we have unleashed the state. And it's all very well to say, well, the state should do this and the state should not do that. But that is tilting at windmills and shouting at the sky. The question is, how do you actually restrain the state so it does what we all want it to do and doesn't do what all they want it to do? Because the state is at its core political. And if the state manages to produce a social contagion in which people believe that children should be transitioned if they think they're in the wrong body, then that's what you're now stuck with. So I think we have to get down to nitty gritty. How do you make the state do what you want it to do and not what everybody else wants it to do when you are the minority? Because we, at the moment in Canada, are the minority.
Okay. Mia, your response?
Well, I haven't gone, but anyway.
Yeah, you're the last one on this list.
I'm last. Okay,
we
sorry.
shift the order. Yeah.
Okay, first of all, I think maybe I went just a little bit of a back and forth with Bruce because I need to ask him questions. Is the state not responsible for child welfare? Like, you can't, they say you have to send your child to school. It's illegal not to educate your child. That's child welfare. You can't let your kid smoke pot. You can't buy your kid pot and give your kid marijuana because the state says no, because it's bad for the child. We do allow the state. Sometimes parents are terrible. Sometimes parents do abuse their children, or they do make terrible decisions.
Sure.
So the state, there is some room for the state to be involved in child welfare, and it hasn't led to all of us being marched down to, get our mandatory vaccines, has it? We've never had.
Pretty close.
But my kids weren't vaccinated during COVID. It was a bit inconvenient, but they didn't force me down and make me get my kid vaccinated.
But the gender thing is the best example of this, and Shawn alluded to it earlier. We have a criminal code offense on the books now that says that if you try to persuade your child that they are actually a girl, then you are committing a criminal offense. That is the state looking after child welfare. Now, I don't disagree with you. Parents should not be able to lock their children in cages in the basement and not feed them. But the question for us is, all right, so what is the principle upon which we are dividing things from things that the state should not be allowed to do, contrary to the parents' wishes, parental rights, and those moments when parental rights count for nothing? Tell me what the principle is. Tell me what the dividing line is between those situations where we give the state the green light to look after child welfare because the parents don't know what they're doing, and those situations where we say, hold on, the parents have the right to decide, and we don't care what the state thinks. Yeah, because we have both those kinds of cases.
So it's each individual case, though.
But Mia, we can't keep doing the back and forth.
Sorry.
I will come back with a question that will tie this in to answer it again, because we'll get into the mechanisms that the state may be able to use. Because I think Bruce agrees with you. He's just saying, be careful. Be careful when you handle that power on what their decision is going to go. It can go both ways. I want to get Shawn his response on this question too, please.
So first of all, I think we need to be very careful. There's a principle in law where it's said that good cases make bad law. And what that means is you have a really sympathetic fact pattern. And so you want to respond emotionally by making a judgment and creating a legal principle to this compelling fact pattern, but then it screws up everything else. And the reality is we cannot structure it so that no children are harmed. Whether we give the state full power or whether we give parents full power, some kids are going to lose. Well, guess what? That's life. So We want a structure so that we minimize that. But whichever way we go, there's going to be problems. I mean, prior to this, like everyone on this panel agrees that children are being harmed with this gender ideology. But the argument before used to be, well, the Jehovah's Witness parents that won't do a blood transfusion for religious reasons, so the state would come in. But now that principle that we allowed, if you at all disagree with cancer treatment, they take your kid just automatically, every single province. If you won't go with what the mainstream medical treatment says, even if you start questioning, like, well, if we put my kid through this horrible chemotherapy, you mean you're telling me it's only like a 10% chance to make a difference? Yeah, well, I disagree with that. Bang, you've lost your rights. So, so here's the problem. And so we're really conflating things here. But, historically, I challenge anyone to disagree that the largest cause of death in our history is government. And, in my opinion, and Mia, you might need to do research on COVID and show a credible report of a child dying from COVID-19 anywhere in the world. But my gosh, we've sure got a lot of reports of children dying from that vaccine. And, now we've got this, Ford Health Center study that wasn't published. So we've got this movie, An Inconvenient Truth, which perfectly matches Dr. Paul Thomas, showing on, children that are vaccinated on every single health measure, autism, arthritis, you name it, on every single health measure, they are not as healthy. And yet, truly, you can say, well, vaccines aren't mandatory, but people are hounded. People are hounded to get vaccinated, and now people are hounded on this gender ideology. So we're experiencing, I think, worse outcomes. So the first, I think, realization is it doesn't matter if you go parental rights or if you go state rights, there's going to be losers. But the risk of the state getting it wrong is so much larger than the odd parent. And then we do have safeguards. So let's just use this as an example. I mean, what if the strict law was that, no parent could consent to their child unless not only did they understand the benefits and the risks, but they actually had to sign off realistically. So what parent is going to sign off on, puberty blockers when they have to sign a form saying, well, I acknowledge that this is going to sterilize my child. I acknowledge actually that my child's frontal lobe won't develop, so they'll never be able to think like an adult. I'm acknowledging that their bones and joints aren't going to grow properly, and that, likely they're going to have serious health consequences for the rest of their lives. I mean, part of the problem is we're not enforcing both national and international obligations to require consent on something that's truly dangerous. And then because the state is imposing this, which is, Bruce's point, the state has the sword. Because the state is imposing this, the safeguard is our criminal law. We have an offense, failing to provide the necessities of life, which is defined about 3 different ways in the criminal code and is excessively broad. And if the state was not pushing this, but was actually there to protect children on this issue, then the first parents that would consent to this would be charged with failing to provide the necessities of life, let alone other things. So, I mean, we have mechanisms in place, but even a bigger problem is if we take away parental rights over fundamental things like medical decisions for children, regardless of how compelling it is, then the state has to make that a reality, undermine parental rights. So we have in schools where the state tells children, well, don't tell your parents. And where the state comes up with ideologies like, well, if you disagree with this, it's abuse. And they have to come up with these ideologies so that the teachers and social workers will buy in and actually believe they're protecting the children. Well, what is the consequences to society if we take away parental rights, which basically forces the state to fracture the family unit to be able to do this? I mean, it's an absolute consequence. And we're doing this because some parents are bad parents. Well, let's enforce the criminal law. So you see, so I'm 100% with Bruce here. If we allow the state to interfere with something as essential as parental rights, then, we're in a world of hurt. we can solve those bad, first of all, we're going to have some fallout, but, we can minimize it with other things.
So Melanie, let's go to you, get back to the morality of this, and we'll change the order. So Mia, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put Bruce after you. So it's going to be Jeff, Mia, Bruce, Shawn.
Oh, I'm going to completely override you and say I want to see what Mia has to say in response, because I feel like there's something interesting in Mia's response here.
All right, overridden.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. Right, so there's so much going on in what you just said, Shawn, and I think the problem is approaching this as an issue of medical regulation, as if gender medicine is a normal field of medicine that functions in the same way that any other field of medicine does. So I like your comment about informed consent, because to me, that's where all of this rests. We don't actually have to ban all of these interventions. We don't have to put age restrictions on. We just have to actually force, and the state would have to do this. And I don't know what to say in any other respect, but the field of gender medicine does not get informed consent from anyone, from the kids, from the parents, from the adults consenting to this. Nobody is giving informed consent because nobody is being informed. And that's the field of gender medicine, because it exists in a parallel world where they're guided by a very deranged, incoherent ideology, and they have no respect for evidence-based medicine, the scientific process, or medical ethics. So no one's giving informed consent. But then how do you make the field of gender medicine adhere to true informed consent? Who's going to step in? Because the field itself, it cannot regulate itself. It's shown us over and over and over again that it simply is incapable of regulating itself. So then who regulates it? And I'm not saying that any of these parents who consent to this being done to their child is a bad parent. I am saying parents don't know best. And in this situation, the parents affirming their child do not know best. They think they're doing the best for their child, but they think they have a child, a special kind of new kind of human being. They have a trans child, and they think this is real medicine and this is the way to help their child. And so in an exceptional situation like this, who steps in? Who steps in and protects the children and the parents from making really bad decisions? And who steps in and makes this field of medicine obtain true and proper informed consent, which they are not doing right now?
Okay, so what you did there was, I think you laid out a great question here that we can continue the rest of the panel. If there is a field of study, and in this case, you laid out gender, if there is no informed consent, no established informed consent, even from the industry, what do you do, Bruce? You're muted, my friend.
It's a very good question and goes to the heart of this. And so let's just take a moment to talk about informed consent, because it is not what people think that it is. I wish it was. I wish informed consent meant that unless people are actually informed about all the risks and possible benefits of a procedure, that their consent is no good. But that is not what informed consent is or how it works. Informed consent is actually not a prerequisite in that sense before a treatment or a procedure can proceed. Informed consent is an element of negligence that you have to claim against a doctor or a hospital or a nurse or whoever. But what that means is this: if your physician fails to inform you to the degree of a reasonably informed and skilled physician, then they may be guilty of negligence, and you can sue them for damages. But just take a note of that standard of care, a reasonably informed and skilled physician. If all of the physicians in their area of specialty do basically the same thing, now it's not average, but reasonable, but nevertheless, what all the other physicians do is a relevant piece of evidence to whether or not they have breached that standard of reasonable care. If all the other physicians do pretty much the same thing, then the physician that you are suing may very well not be negligent. And so even though you are not informed to the extent that we are talking about here, nevertheless, the physician will not be liable. So a lot of this trouble goes to the fact that our legal concept of informed consent is broken and is not what people think that it is. It needs to be fixed, needs to be reformed, but I don't think that that alone, as it stands right now, is a solution to this problem.
May I just ask a question about informed consent, though? Because in my mind, the way I understood it is your doctor has to tell you, one, what your diagnosis is. They have to accurately diagnose you, and then they have to tell you what your treatment options are, all of them,
Yes.
and what happens if you do nothing. Isn't that informed consent?
Well, all of those things are sort of true, but they have to do all of those they have to do all of those things to the standard of a reasonable physician.
What about if they do it?
So in other words, that is not an absolute requirement. It is a relative requirement relative to what the other physicians, the other reasonable physicians might have done. It does not require your physician to know everything about all the risks of the procedure that you're about to go under. It
Right.
requires the physician to have a reasonable understanding comparable to the other physicians in the field.
But what if your physician is an unhinged fanatic?
What if, well, if they're an unhinged fanatic, then they're going to be in a pickle. But if all of the doctors in this field are unhinged fanatics, then you have a problem.
But what if there's a whole movement rising up, going with the evidence-based approach, pushing, doing the systematic reviews, showing that they're all unhinged fanatics?
Yes.
All the information is there
Yes.
for these unhinged fanatics to
Yes.
tell their patients, and they're not
Yes.
doing that. So in my mind, they're not getting informed consent. They're not following the true informed consent process.
Right, and that's possible. But these questions will take place inside a courtroom, and the court will weigh the evidence about whether or not the standard of care is exercised by this physician and others is a reasonable one given the evidence. And so it's possible. It is completely possible. But on the other hand, courts are inclined to listen to the experts. And if the experts are the ones who are involved in this area of medicine, then it's going to be a high threshold to have to try and get over.
Yeah. So Mia, what he's doing there, I think, is really good. He's giving you the legal definition of it, and you have the idealistic definition. If only they all did this, right? And that's kind of the trouble he's laying out here. Let's go to Jeff and then Shawn, because you want to continue this. So Jeff, what happens when the profession or the entire field is not providing good informed information for people to make decisions on? You're muted too, my friend.
My bad. Yeah, when it's ideologically captured as it is, we do kind of have our hands tied, and I think that there is going to have to be some fallout, and we're starting to see the rise of the detransitioners in the United States already, where these lawsuits are going to be taking place. And what I would throw to the group in terms of the informed consent piece is that even the WPATH files, even the WPATH guidelines, they indicate that parental involvement is necessary in order for children to have informed consent. And in my experience, they are not doing that. I actually attended the appointments for my daughter when the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario started calling her phone directly when she turned 16. Because that's the legal age for consent. But even the WPATH files say that's not old enough without parental involvement. And when I threw that back in their faces, they stormed out of the room and said, call security. Mind you, there was nothing belligerent about the way that I approached it. I brought their own guidelines and showed them to them, and they just storm off out of the room. So there is a level of ideological capture there that I think perhaps does open some of these people up to accusations of recklessness and zealousness and lawsuits, I hope. And when it comes to the line, I think I keep referring back to coercion. So there's an act that what the government is doing right now is they're intervening to coerce people to an action when in fact it exists that right to initiate force exists as a means of deterrence, not coercion. So that's again where we've seen this kind of reversal, where we've crossed the line from do as you say, or sorry, do as you will, but don't harm another, to do as I say or else. The state's role is highly inappropriate to come in to coerce people to an action, as opposed to deterring them from harming others.
Okay, and Shawn, when the field is not providing good information, it's contested information, it's not settled information, but a good chunk of them agree with it, is that informed consent and what should be done?
Yeah. So, and first of all, I enjoyed what Jeff just said, and agree with what he said. I think really we're having an issue. So first of all, I appreciate what Bruce was saying about the field of civil negligence. In my opinion, we are obligated internationally to follow things like the Nuremberg Code, and just even in our criminal law, that there is an expectation. And if our law was applied properly, in my opinion, it would be assault without reasonable informed consent, regardless of the civil law. But it doesn't matter, because we know that whatever standards we would have in place, whether they're appropriate or not and need to be better, it's the state that's made the decision not to ensure that there's informed consent. It's state actors and this ideology that's being pushed, and which really is captured this doctor class and the social worker class and this teacher class, so that there isn't informed consent, so that there's pressure to proceed, so that there's not fair discussion. I mean, you'll get kicked out of your transitioning group if you start to even question what's going on or question whether this is appropriate, because there can't be consent. I think a bigger problem is well, why aren't our laws and professional guidelines being followed? I mean, we saw this during COVID. Like, why didn't we have informed consent? We had Health Canada, just to give you an example. I mean, we had Health Canada. Still, you can go to they have website pages for every approved COVID-19 vaccine. And at the top, emphasized every COVID-19 vaccine in Canada has been approved, to be proven to be safe and effective. Well, Health Canada knows that that's political messaging that isn't true, because the tests they were all approved of, the words safety and efficacy aren't even mentioned, and you didn't even have to submit your safety data. So why aren't we following the law with consent in this case? I think I don't know the answer, because the question is how, if there is no informed consent, what do you do? Well, somehow we have to actually get our institutions working for us again. And for that, there has to be personal responsibility for those making the decisions. There's no area in our public life where people making these decisions for not enforcing our laws, they're not charged, they're not jailed, they're not sued. We live in a society where basically our authorities, be they high-level bureaucrats or elected officials, can do whatever they want to us, and there's zero accountability. So I think problem one is we don't have accountability for those that are entrusted to ensure that our laws are followed.
Yeah, okay, so the rule of law is a tough one, because there's certainly a multi-tiered system, and if we were all under a rule of law, this might be a little bit less of a debate and more of a solution panel. Melanie, let's go ahead and jump to your question. I have one more, and then what we're going to do with the panel for the rest of the hour, the last hour, is to open it up to more of a debate, back and forth questions amongst the panelists, because obviously I think that's going to help drive the rest of this. But we have a couple more foundational questions, and then we'll get into an open debate. And it's Melanie.
Thank you. One of the things that I'm hearing over and over and over again is get the government out. That's what I'm hearing repeatedly, with a little bit of maybe we need a bit of government intervention coming from Mia. But generally, sounds like what I'm hearing. And if we get the government out, that in my mind is an argument for more freedom. But if, according to Bruce, we get some more of that freedom, then do we need to accept that some children will be transitioned to save the most children? Does that make sense? I'd love to maybe possibly start with Jeff.
Okay. Well, what is the question? Like, frame the question.
So, okay, let me rephrase. So now that you have some of that context, is that if the principle here that people think is best for the goal of ending child transition, or at least reducing it as much as possible, if that principle is freedom, i.e. getting the government out, do we need to accept that some children, because some parents might decide that they want to transition their children, and the government doesn't have a hand in that decision, do we need to accept that for that freedom, some children are going to get transitioned?
In other words, you got to break a couple legs to have an omelet type of thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would argue no, because transitioning children is child abuse. They're not capable of giving informed consent under any circumstances. They don't fully appreciate the gravity of what's being done to them and all of the key aspects of the whole human experience that will be denied to them throughout their entire lives. You're essentially signing them up to be a permanent medical patient when you do this, and they never really get to come off the drugs or live a normal life. So this idea that young people can really apprehend the gravity of what's being done, I think, is misguided. And so I'll go back to what I said before, like parents don't have the right to abuse their children. And with respect to the proper role of government, as I've described, I think that needs to be codified. This actually needs to be spelled out, because we seem to have lost our way somewhere along the way in terms of actually defining what the role of government is. And perhaps it's a constitutional reform. I'm not the legal scholar on this panel, but yeah, this clear line between what is coercion and what is deterrence. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is prevent harm. However, with freedom comes risk. And so I would make a clear distinction between security and safety, whereas security is a government function and personal safety is my own damn business. We would probably have to do an entire other panel to get into the nuance of that. But ultimately, one of the other things that was brought up here was public servants who have basically gone rogue. I think when they act outside the confines of the law and their mandate, that should unshield them from liability, that they should be open to lawsuits for any impacts to our citizens that those belligerent actions on their part might create. Because there needs to be a deterrent mechanism for them as well. And right now, it just seems like there is no accountability anywhere in government, because they're shielded from the kind of liability that the rest of us would face if we acted in such a manner.
Okay, so how about we go to Shawn, Mia, then Bruce, to finish this one up?
Yeah, so basically the question is if we get the government out and parents have, basically all of the rights, does that mean we have to sacrifice some children to be transitioned? And it's kind of an interesting question, because if government hadn't created this issue, basically in collusion, both federally and provincially, then not a single child would be transitioned. And so government created this issue by being involved. And if, when you have a problem that's created, and so there's a whole bunch of casualties already, yeah, sometimes you've got a transition out, but let's not forget we're only here because government took that role. And again, we have that problem is if government would take the role of actually punishing people that were cutting off perfectly good body parts, so the doctors, and basically the bureaucrats pushing this, and the parents for failing to provide necessities of life under the criminal code or worse, let alone consent provisions and requirements, then we wouldn't be here. So I think that if parents were allowed to have rights back, the real problem would be is somehow we'd have to get control over our criminal and civil law. So there's a real problem with our criminal law being dependent upon the government telling the police to investigate and prosecute crimes. Because right now the police would be prohibited. And in fact, the police, by the way we structured our laws, it could be considered to be a human rights violation if they even investigated this thing. So we've created this problem that we've allowed the state to decide what what criminal law should be enforced and what shouldn't, and having the police bend to the political will or flavor of the day. So I think we have a deeper problem. I know that wasn't the question, but I think we have a deeper problem and actually wouldn't be in this mess if the government didn't get to direct which crimes got investigated, that somehow that was done differently.
Okay. And Mia, yeah, so if parents had full decision, some parents and children may make a decision that doesn't jive with what you're trying to protect here. So yeah, what's your answer to Melanie's question here?
Well, I am going to say I think we're overstating the role of the state in this medical scandal. This medical scandal started in the field of gender medicine. It started in the Netherlands in the 1990s. It spiraled out, it spread, and I don't know if we're talking state involvement with C4. If we are, we're way overstating C4. C4 was a symbolic law that was passed. It doesn't really have any impact on this medical scandal that started in the 1990s and has really been gathering strength since then. This was started by a field of medicine being completely and utterly captured by a false belief and completely discarding all medical ethics, discarding evidence-based medicine, discarding the science-based process, and just pursuing an unproven treatment even for adults and then forcing it onto children. So I don't believe that this medical scandal is because of the state. We could definitely yank away state funding. We don't have to fund this, and that's a whole other debate when debating medical necessity. So I don't know what we would be if we take out state involvement. Kids are still going to be harmed because this is a cultural juggernaut. This is a cultural moment, a mad, insane moment in human history, a mass delusion where a lot of people believe in a type of human being that doesn't exist, and they believe that type of human being needs body parts chopped off. You take away C4, C16, whatever, people are still going to believe that. And so in this interim period where people believe that there's a special type of child out there that needs body parts hacked off, I think the state needs to intervene to protect them. I just don't see how. Well, I prioritize child welfare over, like I said at the beginning, some hypothetical threat that in my mind I can't even imagine what it is.
Okay, and Bruce, if government has no role and we're all completely free, is that an acceptance that some people are going to make decisions that could harm, or in Jeff's case, he says abuse?
It's possible. Sure. No, I tend to agree with Shawn about his diagnosis of how we got here. I do think that if the state got out of it, that a lot of the socializing, the indoctrination, and by the way, there are an awful lot of state functions that are not directed from the center. I mean, the regulation of the medical profession, which is undertaken largely by other doctors, is a state function. If you have mandates from the regulator about this, that is a state function. And so when we're talking about getting the state out of this, we are talking about getting the state out of all of it, including the funding, but not just the funding. And yes, C4 is symbolic, but it is very symbolic of the state's attitude towards this. But let's just talk about freedom for a minute. In the big picture sense, we all would like a world in which there is no tragedy. If you have a free country, that is not going to happen. There is going to be tragedy because people are free to make their own mistakes. And if you have a regime of parental rights wherein the parents are the ones to make the calls, primarily, assuming it's not, locking the kids in the cage in the basement, failing to provide the necessities of life. If it is the parents that are making the calls. So, for example, there was a case a few years ago of two parents who had a sick child, and they tried to cure the child with natural remedies. It didn't work. It turned out the child had meningitis, and at the last hour they went to the hospital. It was too late. The child died, and the parents were charged.
You got to let me chime in on that one later, because I was
sure.
counsel.
Right. And you know, that the authorities said, well, you know, you haven't done well by the child. Those are the kinds of decisions that the parents are entitled to make. And whether or not you consider that a tragedy or not, you're going to have some children end up dead because the decision was wrong. But that is part of a free society in which the parents have the primary responsibility for their children. Now, I agree. I'm going to say it again. I agree that this is abominable and that parents should not be deciding this for their children. But it is not okay. It's not enough simply to appeal to quote the science. An appeal to the science is an appeal to authority. And the state is authority. An appeal to the science is not the same thing at all as endorsing the idea of parental rights, because parents are not obliged to go along with, you know, the approved science. I mean, imagine if that was the rule during COVID, because, you know, we all argue about whether or not the science during COVID was actually the science or not. That's beside the point. The science is a social political phenomenon. It does not depend on the actual science. And the parents that are involved can't dictate what the science says. So either the parents have the rights or somebody else does, the science notwithstanding. And so, yes, I agree with Shawn that if you get the state out of this, if you found some way to do this, you would have a much different set of results. So here's a comparison just to finish off. You can sort of say the same thing about MAID today. Medical assistance in dying. We have an epidemic of people being killed by doctors in this country. Why? Because the state runs the show. The state funds it. The state encourages it. The state runs the healthcare. The state says, well, we can't afford to give you actual treatment, so how about we kill you instead? That's the state doing that. What's the solution to that? It is not to outlaw assisted suicide. If you want to die and you're sick and you want to get a doctor to help you die, I've got no problem with that. The problem is the state is involved. The state is encouraging it. The state is driving the bus. And if you stop the state from doing that in the MAID situation, you'll get a whole lot fewer people deciding to go through with this kind of thing. And I think the same is the case for the appalling gender transitioning of children.
Okay, so let's go to Shawn, because they actually referred to.
Actually, I don't want us to get off topic, so it doesn't matter. But I think Bruce has raised a great point, because every parent will know that, you know, you've got a child with a fever and you're taking the temperature and it's like 103. Do we go to the hospital? Oh, it's 104. Do we go to the hospital? You know, the odd time we're going to make the wrong decision there. And, you know, that's just the way it is. You know, we're mortal beings, and even well-meaning parents are going to make the wrong decisions. And some are going to make decisions we completely disagree with, but we could have other means of dealing with that. So sorry for letting me jump in.
No worries. And what I'm going to do is I have one more question, and then we're going to get into more of an open format where there'll be some more back and forth, because I think this next one is going to lay down a little bit more foundation.
But
so here in Alberta.
Sorry, can I get back? Because I actually do feel bad. There were two trials. You know, there was one where they were convicted and Supreme Court of Canada overturned it. And there was one where they were acquitted. In both trials, there were findings of fact the child did not die of bacterial meningitis. And the chief medical examiner, like the top pathologist, Dr. Annie Savinjo, who probably was the top pathologist in Canada at the time, said, well, it was viral meningitis, which would be completely meaningless and didn't cause death. She found that the cause of death was actually Alberta Health Services that had, so they have all the ambulances in southern Alberta, And there's 4 different ways of getting an airway. And Alberta Health Services made a decision to take the 4 ways of getting an airway out of every single ambulance for anyone under the age of 12. And the paramedics, one of which was crying on the stand, said for a full year, we're basically telling management the first infant we get that needs an airway dies. And that was Ezekiel. So there's actually recorded, we can hear his breathing because there's a 911 call, and the ambulance can't get air into him for 8 minutes and 38 seconds. And he was already compromised with what the chief medical officer thought was croup, listening to his breathing on the recording. So yeah, so I just, in fairness to that couple, there's more to that story.
Yeah, and Bruce, I did want him to step in on that one because he's familiar with the case that you were
Oh
referring
yeah,
to.
no, I totally agree. Yeah, great.
Yeah, because I didn't want the record to show that maybe the parents did something wrong here. In
No,
fact,
I was not blaming the
they
parents.
did.
I'm just saying tragedies happen. That's all.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so then my next one, and then we'll get into more of an open debate. And we have one Albertan here, other than myself, but Daniel Smith. She is using the notwithstanding clause to protect children, puberty blockers, and stuff like that. Is that a step in the right direction, or is that overreach? Will be my question. We'll start with Mia. We'll go Bruce, Jeff, and then Shawn, if you don't mind.
I'm not going to surprise anyone with my answer. Of course, it is exactly. So what Danielle Smith is doing by putting an age restriction on this experimental treatment is the second worst option, in my opinion. The worst option is doing nothing and allowing these kids to continue to be harmed, and the government stepping in and placing a temporary restriction on these treatments is the second worst option. My first choice, of course, would be the field of gender medicine gets it together and realizes the harm that they're doing, but that is completely impossible. They will never do that. So I'm all for Danielle Smith, of course.
Okay, Bruce.
This is a Band-Aid, I think. This is not getting the government out of this business. This is the government issuing an edict about what is going to happen or not happen in the facilities that it funds. I mean, I would have preferred Danielle Smith to address all of the underlying things that we're talking about. So, for example, she could have amended the Alberta Human Rights Code to take out, gender expression and gender identity out of the Human Rights Code as a ground for discrimination. She could have said Alberta Health Services will not be involved in any of this kind of care. If you're going to get this kind of care, you get it outside the system. It's got nothing to do with the government. You got to got, one better than that. And I know this is a pipe dream. I'm not actually expecting her to do that. But she could have said, you know what? We don't believe in socialized medicine anymore in this province. We're ditching the single payer healthcare system. And this kind of problem and any other, you go to your own doctor and you figure it out. We are going to change the curriculum in the schools, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is embedded in all kinds of different nooks and crannies inside the provincial managerial state. And sure, she gives an edict that says this won't happen, but that's not actually addressing the phenomenon that we've been talking about.
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah, I do tend to agree that I will take what Danielle Smith has done, but it doesn't go far enough. She's still going to allow puberty blockers for 16-year-olds, which doesn't really make any sense anyway, because they've already entered puberty at that point. And we are talking about chemical castration drugs that should not be given to anybody but a sex offender. So or a prostate cancer patient for that matter. But they absolutely should not be given to children. They're being prescribed off-label. You remember how they were not allowed to prescribe off-label ivermectin during the pandemic, and that's what they're doing right now. Is they're prescribing chemical castration drugs to children off-label, and they're still allowing these surgeries, like the top and bottom surgeries, which are clearly marketing terms that are targeting children. They are put off until they are 18. I still think that it should be banned for children and youth, as in up to 25. Some of the Biden likes to cite that study that says that only 1% of people regret their transition, but that is using data from the early 80s, where the average age for transitioners in Canada was 28, for example. And there's no need for public funding to go toward any of this stuff, because it is purely cosmetic. But the problem that we have is there's an entire framework that's been set up. It all goes back to this ideology. This is what we're really battling with, is an ideology, I think. But between the SOGI curriculum that indoctrinates kids and sets up the pipeline to becoming a permanent medical patient, Bill C-16 with its introduction of the ideological terms, gender identity and gender expression as prohibited grounds for discrimination. That has trickle-down effect to the provinces, of course. Also, Bill C-4, I heard a few people say that it's symbolic. That's not my understanding. The thing is that it essentially makes biomedical transition the only legal option for somebody who expresses gender dysphoria, because it is illegal to counsel somebody to be cisgender, which is a gender Marxist term. So they've imposed a Marxist worldview on gender on the rest of us through this legislation, and I think that crosses the line into coercion as opposed to deterrence. You may not counsel somebody to be cisgender, but you may counsel them to explore a transgender identity. So it's a one-way street that results in gender-affirming care being performed, and that is the last component of the medicalization pipeline, this framework that's been set up with the gender-affirming care in the medical establishment. And yes, it would still be happening were it not for this legislation, but it'd be happening a heck of a lot less, because the legislation really kind of puts it on steroids and facilitates a lot of this act, and criminalizes parents for trying to intervene to prevent these kinds of harms from being done to their children. And it criminalizes therapists as well, for providing talk therapy to alleviate gender dysphoria and help a child feel comfortable in their natural bodies.
And then Shawn, has Danielle Smith gone far enough, not far enough? Opinion.
Well, actually, what jumped out with me is the use of the notwithstanding clause. So in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, so the Constitution Act of 1982, I think it's section 33 is the notwithstanding clause, which for some rights guaranteed in there, it allows government to override them for a set period of time before they have to invoke the clause again. So isn't it interesting that, we haven't put gender ideology into the charter. We're now just reading that in to, rights that were already there, such as, you can't discriminate based on sex. So, but how did we arrive here? And this was all planned. Nothing this major happens by accident. And this has all come from the UN. So we've entered international treaty agreements on human rights law that have obligated us to put into our federal human rights legislation and our provincial human rights legislation to ban discrimination based on gender ideology. So this was a decision made at the international treaty level. And once we go there, once we adopt that, and there's a big question as to why we've done that and why the provinces have gone along with that, but we've added it into the criminal code. I mean, Bruce touched on this, but the anti-transitioning part of the criminal code, listen to this, just listen to how obscene this is. So you can count, let's say you have a child that is born a male. It's legal for you to, you know, move heaven and earth and do whatever you want to convince your boy, you know, your child that was born as a male to be a girl, to be a cat, to be, you know, any one of the how many identifications there are, I don't even know. That's perfectly legal. But you cannot, it's a crime in Canada to counsel your you know, child born as a male to identify as a male if they identify as something else. And this has come about because of our international treaty obligations. And we have an international treaty obligation to teach SOGI. Now, the federal government can't impose that on the provinces. So that's why the school boards and teachers can individually refuse it unless a province makes it mandatory. But, you know, I just find it interesting that we would have to use a constitutional notwithstanding clause at all. And, you know, clearly it's a stopgap and it doesn't go far enough, in my opinion. But it's just absolutely amazing that, you know, we'd actually have to create a constitutional exemption, even just to go part way in preventing children from being transitioned with what, in my opinion, is a clear crime under our criminal law. Like, I mean, I think these doctors should be investigated and jailed, and those responsible for pushing this. That's my opinion. So it's just amazing that instead the government of Alberta actually has to do a very rare thing to support a law and exempt it from the application of some provisions of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Like, that's when you know that everything's upside down and our system is broken.
May I just add though, she had to do the notwithstanding clause because of the legal challenges brought by EGAL. A lot I think of what is being attributed to state interference has to be understood as NGO interference. EGAL is the one who launched the charter challenge, section 12, it was cruel and unusual punishment if you deny this treatment. Can't remember, there was a security of the person, section 7. Like, it's the reason Danielle Smith had to do that is not because of any state interference, it's because of EGAL using the charter in a weird, warped way to try and continue this medical scandal.
Right,
Well,
but my point is they you know, go back 20 years. There's no way that an NGO would even think of launching a challenge like that because our laws hadn't been defined and progressed there. This has been forced on us through a legal structure. That's how Barry Neufeld can be fined $750,000 for challenging this. It's because we've literally criminalized this and by deliberate decisions and with steps. So they you know, agree that we're going to do this, and then they've been implementing it into our legal structure federally and provincially and into our education system, and definitely teaching and indoctrinating the teachers and social workers. I mean, they're of the opinion, the teachers and social workers, that if a parent disagrees with this, that's abusive and that the child needs to be protected. Well, we got there deliberately. That didn't happen by accident.
But it wasn't the state; it was the NGOs, it was the activists that they
but
put in.
But the NGOs are the state today. A lot of NGOs, and I don't know about EGAL, but I wouldn't be surprised.
EGAL is federal funded.
That's exactly what I was about to say, right? So this is an arm of the state, but also the other thing that's involved here, the thing that we're in danger of taking for granted, is that the state that if you were to, you know, get around all of these other problems that are entrenched in the curriculum and in the law and in the, you know, human rights codes and so on, that you would get neutral arbiters in the tribunals and the courts. The tribunals and the courts are also part of the state.
Yeah.
The lawyers and the judges have also been trained to see things in a particular way. In other words, this is a whole of state problem. And you can't just reach in and tweak something and get the thing to go away. This is about the way that the society is governed, and the forces that have managed to take over that state structure and embed an ideology into it. And of course, that ideology is very far-ranging. This gender thing is just one aspect of it, but it's a very important aspect of it, of course. But you're in order to address the gender problem, you really have to address our big societal problem, our civilizational problem. And that has very much to do with the way the Constitution is built, the way our government works, the way that the pipeline works for feeding people, through their schooling at all levels, including universities and medical schools and law schools, and into positions of power.
Can I just, before we move on, because there's two things that I agreed with you on the last time you spoke that I just want to bring up, but I also want to ask you a question about them, because you said Danielle Smith could have removed gender identity and gender expression from the Human Rights Code. I fully agree with that. Of course, I don't think she went anywhere near far enough, but I just think it's a band-aid, like you said. And the other thing was Alberta could just say, we're not paying for any of this. We're not dealing with any of it. Right. And I agree with that too. I think that's also the way that we need to go. But then would that not open it up to the state saying, well, we're not paying for that treatment because we don't agree with that, or we're not paying for, is that not also state interference?
Well, yes. So my attitude towards that is that there should not be a single payer healthcare system. I don't believe in socialized medicine. I don't think there ought to be a public healthcare system. I think people's healthcare is their own business, and they should be able to find doctors and hospitals and so on that will treat them in the way that they want to be treated. I really don't believe even in the degree of medical regulation that we have, because that regulation is run in accordance with an ideology. And so people's healthcare is being dictated to them. They think it's done in a neutral, objective, science-based way. It is nothing of the sort. And so the fact that we have the system that we have means that by definition that medicine is compromised. The best solution to that, for my money, is to get the state out of the business of healthcare, period.
So who pays for it then? We pay for our own healthcare?
Can I build on what Bruce
we're actually going to enter the open debate question period right now. Yeah. What Melanie's going to do is she's going to frame an open question, and then we're going to continue doing what you guys are doing right now. Okay.
I was hoping to build on what Bruce was saying, though, because I think that little bit of understanding that would be helpful.
Yep. So Melanie, throw that open question, and we'll go to Shawn next.
Yeah, hopefully this will be useful. So we were just talking about human rights. Obviously, we started this episode talking about Barry Neufeld, who was fined $750,000 for not believing in gender ideology. We have, I know with my research, schools heavily rely on human rights to justify a lot of the LGBTQ curriculum that is seen, or embedding this within the curriculum, also telling parents that they cannot opt out. It is cross-curriculum. It's embedded everywhere. And so it seems that the human rights is quite responsible for a lot of this, the Human Rights Commission and tribunals. But I guess my question is, if we look at the Human Rights Commissions and tribunals, is it a question of repealing sections of the human rights, or is it a question? Recently, Tara Armstrong was in the legislature in British Columbia calling to abolish the Human Rights Code altogether in British Columbia. That didn't go down very well, but is that something that possibly should be discussed?
Yes.
So we'll go to Shawn, and then Shawn, you can go build on to what you heard before, and then get into this human rights.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks. I just think Bruce was hitting a really important topic, and some people actually might not understand how deep it goes. So let's just talk serious health conditions. So Health Canada is the gatekeeper for approving drugs for serious health conditions. They've structured it so that in the lifetime of anyone watching this, every single drug that's been approved to treat serious health conditions, with the exception of Primarin, had a patent, meaning that they were synthetic chemicals, which is what the most dangerous class of drugs possible. Well, how can it possibly be that, since I think it was 1945 or something when we came out with this requirement that drugs had to be pre-approved by the government, how can it be that the only treatments that we've approved are novel chemicals that had a patent when they went through the drug approval process. And this is by design. It doesn't mean that they work better than non-synthetic chemicals. So, and the other interesting thing then is so 99.9% of the chemical drug companies' profits are the prescription drugs. So I appreciate we can go and buy over-the-counter Tylenol and cold remedies and that, but what we're really talking about here as far as profits are only accessed by prescription. Well, think about this for our then government-funded healthcare system. So all other treatments are illegal except the chemical drugs. And we can only legally access the only approved treatments. Surgery, our only approved treatments are surgery and or patented chemical drugs. We can only access those legally through government-funded healthcare. So by definition, government-funded healthcare is the marketing and distribution arm of the chemical drug industry, which by itself is just fascinating. And it's so captured that it's just absolutely crazy. And I couldn't agree with Bruce more that, this whole socialized medicine it's become an absolute train wreck, and it's likely our leading cause of death, which would be a completely different discussion, which would surprise a lot of people. So I'll get to the question though. So, I mean, really the question is, should we even be considering abolishing these human rights tribunals? And I will share with the audience that, back, I think it was around early 90s, I worked for the BC Human Rights Tribunal. And in my opinion, absolutely. So, because the problem is we have allowed it to become politicized. I think we have to base our system. I know Bruce has done some work on, well, what would a constitution look like? And, it's really government having limited power. And basically we can't harm each other. So, that's going to be manifested in a civil system and in a criminal system. But, we kind of get into a really interesting place. And so it's forbidden for us to suggest that. But if we're not willing to even have this discussion, then the reality is that more things will be added. Different types of tribunals will be created. And we will find ourselves even in a worse administrative state nightmare where people like Barry Neufeld are being absolutely terrorized and destroyed. I mean, it's not just $750,000, it's the spiritual and emotional damage that's done in having to go through that process. So the problem is that these human rights tribunals are creating a power structure that itself is not consistent with a free society. And I'm not saying that we can harm each other. I'm the first person to say that we can't, but this isn't the appropriate structure.
Jeff?
Yeah, this is a bit of a tricky one. I was really pleased to see Tara Armstrong stepping up the way that she did and calling for the abolition of the human rights panels. I think perhaps that was a little bit of, a page out of Donald Trump's Art of the Deal, because I don't think she ever really expected that to go through. It was more like the really big ask that he comes out with first, and then we'll let them walk us back to what we expected in the first place, something more reasonable. And it really has been the way that the tribunals have conducted themselves, I think, that has been so terribly problematic. The way the laws have been modified in very recent years have been very, very problematic because they're prescribing in an ideological position. And there's a lot of this, like people have been saying, this inversion of the moral paradigm as well, where, in the case of, say, gender identity and gender expression, if we include those as prohibited grounds for discrimination, well, usually when we're talking about discrimination, we're talking about, preventing people from getting access to jobs, housing, healthcare, services, goods for that matter. In general, you may not discriminate against somebody, may not deny them access to services and goods, on these bases. And one of them would be religion, for example. So you may not discriminate against somebody deny them access to services for being Catholic. But in the case of the gender identity and gender expression, when that got introduced, it's not that we're saying businesses may not discriminate on the basis of how a person chooses to dress, which is what gender expression is at the end of the day. It's a fashion statement. So you may not discriminate against somebody for that reason. It goes way beyond that to the point where the tribunals are acting as a mechanism of ideological enforcement. You must accept the ideological precepts that this person holds. You must accept that this man in a dress is in fact a woman. Whereas with everything else, going back to the Catholic example, it's not considered discrimination to say, I understand that you're a Catholic, but I'm not. I don't believe those things. So that's where this kind of inversion has really taken place. And I think it has everything to do with this Marxist ideology, this gender ideology, which is part of a broader Marxist paradigm that is really gaining steam all over the world and being imposed on us. And I do see the UN as something of a focal point for that. It is a democracy of dictators that's dominated by China, after all. And a lot of this falls into what the critical theorists talked about, the Marxist professors of the Frankfurt School in Germany, when they talked about reshaping society, capturing the cultural hegemony and then reshaping the society in the Marxist image. And even the word like cissexual originates with a sexologist from the Frankfurt School in Germany by the name of Volkmar Segush. And the gender is performative. Gender is a social construct, is something that Judith Butler, who is an American critical theorist, advanced back in the 90s. And it seems like there's been this kind of a melding of the terms. And you've got John Money's idea of gender identity, which isn't really Marxist, but it's all kind of come together as part of a broader ideology. And that is what we're fighting at the end of the day, I think, is the mindset, the ideology of these people, because they very well could sit on these tribunals and say, that discrimination means denying access to services and care on these bases, when in fact they have completely inverted the paradigm and said, you must act in a certain way. We're not deterring you from acting in a certain way now. You must act in a certain way because of these ideological prescriptions.
Okay, Jeff, but should the code be amended or abolished or none at all?
I think it should be amended. I don't think that it should be abolished. We probably don't want to live in a society where, discrimination and abuse against people on the basis of their immutable characteristics or their religion or even their political position is necessarily the kind of society that we want to live in. But I think the problem is the ideological capture that's taken place over the last several years. And so it's not only just that we see these ideological terms creeping into the law, but also the people who are charged with administering these tribunals, they are captured as well, and so there's a combination. I think a very it's a very sticky situation, but at the end of the day, it comes down to culture, I'm afraid.
Okay, so I'm going to go to Bruce. Bruce, I pretty much can guess where you're going to go with yours, but I also want to ask, in the Barry Neufeld decision, there was talk about Christianity, belief in Christianity, and there was a reference to it. Do you remember that part? Can you touch on that as well?
Vaguely. But let me answer the basic question first.
Yeah.
About the human rights codes. And my answer is abolished. No question. Get rid of them. I agree they've been captured. I agree with the diagnosis that Jeff has given about how they've been undermined. But they are conceptually flawed. They always have been. Now keep this in mind. The source of the idea that governments and laws should not discriminate between people, which is a very good idea, is contained in the Charter. Now, that's gone off track too, very, very badly. It now means the opposite, but that's a different story altogether. It's supposed to be in the Constitution. The problem with human rights codes is that they apply to private people. Here's what the government is saying. You, in your private life, are not allowed to prefer some people over others. Now, it only applies in particular situations. Now, why is that? Let's say you are inviting people over for dinner. Are you allowed to discriminate in the way that you choose the people? Of course. Because it's your living room, it's your dinner party, your friends. You can discriminate in any way you want. Discriminate means to tell apart and treat differently. Why do we want a society in which people are not free to decide who they want to do business with? Part of the problem with this is that idea has been accepted, but it's not even the idea. People think that the human rights codes mean that you can't discriminate, but actually it doesn't mean that at all. Because of the way they are drafted, constructed, it means that if you are a particular category of person, let's say you are a woman and you want to put together a law firm in which women work. You want to have a law firm of 5 women, 5 partners. Are you allowed to do that? The answer is probably yes. Why? Because of what the Human Rights Code says. Don't you have to discriminate in order to make sure that your 5 lawyers are women? Yes. Why are you allowed to do that? Well, they'll call it a special program, as it's called in the Ontario statute or dealt with in other ways in other statutes. But you are allowed to do that if you are a particular class of person. But if you are a man, you cannot decide to have a law firm made of men, because that would be discrimination against women. In other words, the first idea is bad, and then that first idea is made worse by twisting it. We would all be more free to make our own decisions about our own lives, our own preferences, if the Human Rights Code did not exist. The Human Rights Code has become a weapon. That weapon is used to infringe upon the freedom of some people to the detriment of other people. No, sorry, for the benefit of other people, to infringe the freedom of some people for the benefit of other people. And there is no area where that is more acutely the case than in the gender situation, to be true. But it's not limited to that. The human rights codes must go. They are inconsistent with a free country.
Hey, Mia, you're nodding a lot and you kind of posed this question. What are your thoughts?
It's great. Oh, I'm ending on completely agreeing with Bruce. I completely agree in everything that everyone just said. Really, get rid of them. They don't benefit us in any way. They are obviously right now completely rotten to the core. I will say though that if a woman wanted to open her all women law firm, she wouldn't be allowed to. She'd have to let the men who believe they have women's souls in. There's no way she'd be allowed to
Right.
have it. Right?
Yes. Right.
So yeah, get rid of them. I fully support this. I hope it happens.
Okay, so based on that, this is maybe slightly off topic, but all except for Jeff seem to agree to just abolish these human rights. There's just the entire code. And if that's the case, is that even possible in a country like Canada? Because people seem to really bristle over this idea, even though many people see the issue. I mean, the Barry Neufeld case became pretty viral and admittedly ended up in America. And I think even some British publications picked up on it too. So people see the issues, right? They see the problems with it. But then when you start mentioning the idea of rolling back any of it, or God forbid, abolishing it, people then become very precious over maintaining that system. So how would we even convince Canadians to do it?
Oh,
Okay,
God.
that's something that Bruce and I were actually talking about this week, which was, what is Canada? And Canada is now a socialist system. And it's not the minority pushing the majority anymore. It's the majority of socialism. Bruce, you want to kind of expand on that? Because I think that ties into what
Sure.
Melanie just asked.
Sure. And I love the word that Melanie just used, precious. I mean, in a way, that's a great word to use to describe the present political Canadian character. Precious. Precious. But yes, this is a bitter lesson that people on the right, I'm going to use that term, people on the right, a bitter lesson that people on the right in Canada refuse to confront, which is they live in a progressive socialist country. Most of the people vote for leftist parties. People believe in progressive values. All the institutions reflect progressive ideas, including the most important ones, the tribunals and the courts and the bureaucracies. The idea that you're going to be able to introduce legislation and repeal the human rights codes is a pipe dream. We don't live in that kind of a country, and a lot of the solutions that we've been playing with in this session about the gender ideology is just that, is playing with it. You're assuming, a lot of these things assume that we have a country that we do not actually have, filled with people that do not actually exist. Canadians have a particular set of ideas, not all of them, of course, everybody is different, but as a population, you're not going to be able to go anywhere. I was listening to a conservative strategist give his review of last year's election, and I'm not a partisan conservative. I have a lot of trouble with all the things that conservative parties do too, like vote for Bill C-4. So they're no solution to all of this either. But in terms of the spectrum, he was saying, how sorry he was to lose, of course, but he said, I'm really happy with the numbers from the election because we managed to get 41% of the vote. And 41%, he said, is the high watermark for the Conservative Party in the modern era. And I sat there and I thought to myself, it's the high watermark. That means you're telling me that that's as good as you can expect to do. That means that you can never win. As progressive as you are, you're still the most conservative party. That means you can never win unless you split the left vote. Never. And you can never actually represent the majority of the people in the country. You live in a progressive socialist country. And until you fix the ideas in the minds of many of the people, none of this is going to change.
Hey, Mia, we're going to go to you now because what we're talking about here is accepting Canada for what it is, not necessarily what we want it to be. And what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think this explains why I support Danielle Smith's move to protect kids. And it's because I'm realistic and I know that Canada's not ready for remove gender identity completely from the Human Rights Code. It's not ready for the no form of this is medicine, so don't fund any of it. We're not ready for put these criminals on trial. We're not ready for any of that. So I just see Danielle Smith stepping in and protecting the kids who absolutely cannot make these decisions as the least worst option. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Shawn, will come to you now. You've seen the heart of Canada. Oh, Bruce is right on this one.
Yeah, I think, no, Bruce is absolutely right. I think that the numbers right now is Carney believes, and he's probably correct, that if he called an election right now, they'd have a solid majority government. So, which is really interesting because he's actually been calling for universal basic income, which, that's a pretty big step between full socialism. Now, the question was, is it possible? I mean, is it possible for us to abolish human rights tribunals? And that's really a narrative question, because the reality is they were created in my lifetime, so they're a relatively new thing, and we were perfectly fine before. Like, we were perfectly fine before, but it's just funny, you get accustomed to something, and it's because of the narrative. So I think the real problem with Canada is that the government absolutely controls the narrative. I mean, the constitutional challenge in Alberta was by an NGO that's funded by government. And, you know, we have a federal government that takes in so much money and funds the CBC and funds the private media and funds all these NGOs. So, you know, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if they haven't colluded with the social media companies to control the narrative in Canada also. So we basically, what we have here is a problem with government controlling the narrative. And unless that's fixed, because that's the real issue, I think, you know, if Canadians understood, wait a second, the narrative's being controlled, and we actually have a real fundamental freedom problem in where we're going. I mean, so is it possible? Only if somehow government was to lose control of the narrative, because that's what we're experiencing here. I mean, we're right in Noam Chomsky's manufacturing consent. The government's controlling the narrative, so they're controlling. They're basically controlling society. We're not a free society because the government controls the narrative.
And Jeff, as we come to you, I just want to remind our audience about how things can change over time, because it's a bit of a cycle. Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. So were we during a good times create weak men phase when we created a Human Rights Commission, and do we have to go through a cycle to kind of get rid of it? You're muted. You're creating quiet men.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Pardon me. I shouldn't be so polite, but yes, I think the answer is yes, but there is kind of an issue with the way that we're framing this as well. Clearly, we are in the times when weak men create hard times right now, and you're referencing Strauss-Howe generational theory, by the way, which is something I talk about quite a bit, and the fact that we're in a fourth turning, which is a crisis era that recurs every 4 generations, the last one being the Second World War, once a human lifetime global crisis. But setting that aside for a second, the thing is that yes, I agree that we live in a progressive country, but that's a cultural issue. So I'm going to go back to what I was saying about the issue that we have with culture. It's not just that politics is downstream from culture and therefore law is downstream from culture, but also we have these self-righteous cultural ideologues running these NGOs, human rights commissions, and they're abusing the law as well. When it comes to what we think of as liberal and conservative, I think is not the way that things started out. Like, we are a liberal democracy. That's how we were founded in the classically liberal tradition. And classical liberalism is a right-wing position. Sir John A. Macdonald's party was the Liberal Conservative Party of Canada. And that makes sense in the original paradigm, where liberalism is right-wing, conservatism is something that conserves those classically liberal values. So they're both right-wing ideologies. But right now we have this kind of paradigm flip where all of the mainstream parties are progressive parties, which is just an Orwellian euphemism for socialist. So it is a collectivist ideology. It's on the left, as opposed to an individualist ideology, which is on the right. And they're all masquerading as these kind of right-wing. They're using right-wing branding, essentially. So I think we kind of need to separate out the fundamental philosophies from the branding that they're using, and recognize that there has been this cultural shift over the years, and it will shift back. Like, I can see the pendulum is starting to come back already, and I think it's going to be Gen Z to the rescue, because they're already polling as the most conservative generation for their age in all of Canadian history. Nobody has been so thoroughly abused in the last 10 years in this country than our kids. And these kids are coming of age. They're coming into voting age now. They're getting involved in politics, and they're never going to vote for the left, I don't think, in their lifetimes. And it is the boomer generation, the older generation, who remember the liberals of the days of old. They still think that it's their mother and father's party from when they were kids, and they are the ones who are voting for the Liberals consistently, the most consistently, overwhelmingly. All the other generations are kind of going in the other direction. And none of this would be happening if the GI generation were still alive. They never would have put up with this. If you just look at any number of scandals, like the sponsorship scandal, for example, that basically brought the government to its knees, that didn't come anywhere near what we're faced with today. But they're no longer with us. They're no longer voting. And I think it's going to take Gen Z fully aging into the electorate, and some of the older generations, unfortunately, dying off. But this is the cycle that we live through, and that pendulum will eventually come back. I think the concern should be to make sure that it doesn't stop in the wrong place, because the last time it came back, we got Nazi Germany. But we're not in terrible jeopardy of that, I think, but we still have about another 4 or 5 years to go before we're going to see anything remotely resemblant of a normal Canadian society again.
Okay, and we do have to wrap up because we're down to our last couple minutes here. So I wanted to kind of highlight something that you said there, Jeff, which I think is very important to remember, is this pendulum does swing. And we have 2 people who would, in this episode here, that could consider themselves left until the radicalization and harm towards children started to be recognized. So maybe that's something that will be scaled up over these kind of conversations, and more people will realize that, and that can help that pendulum continue swing. Melanie, I'm going to throw it to you if you want to kind of close up here.
And on that note, I want to firmly disagree with Shawn that we can blame government controlling narratives for this problem, because the British also have a problem with the government controlling narratives and are certainly not sitting down taking it. The major parties in that country may or may not exist after the next election. And so I don't agree that is simply a question of government narrative. I think we do have a cultural shift, cultural change, and I think it is hopefully that might change in this country. I wanted to thank Jason for inviting me to be your co-host, and everyone for answering the questions on the panel tonight. I certainly learned a lot about how maybe even trying to diagnose some of the issues around gender rights for children, parental rights in Canada. So this has been a really great, fantastic conversation. Thank you, everybody.
And I want to echo a lot of what Melanie said there at the end. I want to thank all 4 of you for joining this panel. I wanted to have an open conversation and have various perspectives, and I think we got to that today. This is a conversation we absolutely need to continue in the future as well. So I hope everybody can share this out and make sure that you give it a like, and we'll do some more of these. So we have like 3 minutes. So if you guys can be very quick, we can do a quick goodbye. We'll start with Shawn.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think there's also another societal thing happening, because I actually really like Jeff talking about how, the pendulum's starting to swing. There's also a religious revival happening where people are returning to God and Jesus, and that's going to affect the culture. I mean, at the end of the day, it's up to us. And I actually think we're all in this period of time where we're specifically designed to be here to have this experience and to turn this bus around. I think Canada could have a great future, but usually the bread has to run out before people will get to the streets and change things.
Yeah, we've heard that one many times. Once the bread line starts, decisions could be changed. Jeff, a quick goodbye.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me to come on to fill in, by the way. So it was really great to get a chance to discuss these issues with you all. And I thanks so much to our gracious hosts. And we absolutely need to keep this conversation going. So keep your earballs peeled in the next few months. Trying to ramp up a few initiatives, and maybe I'll reach out to you guys and see if there's any support that you're willing to lend.
Absolutely, Jeff. And I'm sure everybody on this panel would love to hear from you. Bruce, quick goodbye.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you for having me. It's been a great conversation. Thanks for everybody. I do hope that Shawn and Jeff are right about the culture. I hate to end on a downer, but the way I've described it in the past is, yeah, the pendulum swings, but the pendulum is on a cart, and the cart is heading down the hill. The big picture here, I think, does not allow for a very optimistic view of changing the way we are governed because government has taken on the job of managing society. And even those Gen Z people, as right-wing as they may seem to be, for example, seem to want the government to solve the housing problem, for example. It's that inclination that I would like to see fading away, but I don't see that.
You wouldn't be cold water Bruce without some cold water at the end. Nia, quick goodbye.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a great conversation. I'm going to end on the subject of gender issues, gender rights, who gets to decide. Children cannot consent. Parents cannot consent because they are not being informed. And as far as I'm concerned, no doctor no ideological fanatic has the right to decide to experiment on vulnerable kids. That's my closing remark.
Well, thank you very much. And we may not have been successful at removing the Human Rights Commission, but we may have fully funded the Human Rights BC Commission after this episode, with all 6 of us. Might get an invoice at some point here. Right. But everybody, thank you a lot for hanging out with us. Panelists, hang on for a sec as I end the show. I'm just going to have a quick little thank you in the backstage. But to everybody watching, please share us out. Really appreciate it. Make sure you give everybody a follow. All our X's are available there, and some Facebook as well. And it was great to hear from all of these. Let's have these conversations, continue them in the future. Everybody take care, and God bless.